Son inherits father's old truck, stops cold when he sees the inside. The sky was the color of wet cement the day they buried Ray Harper. Dylan stood at the edge of the grave, watching as they lowered his father's casket into the ground. The rain had started as a drizzle but was now coming down in earnest, soaking through Dylan's borrowed suit. He hadn't owned a suit since his high school graduation, and even then, it had been a rental. "Are you going to throw some dirt?" asked the funeral director, a man with skin like parchment, and eyes that had witnessed too many griefs. Dylan took the handful of soil, feeling it crumble between his fingers. He let it fall, watching as it scattered across the polished wood of the casket. The sound it made was hollow, like everything else about this day. 28 years old, and Dylan Harper barely knew the man they were burying. Ray Harper had been a ghost in his own home for as long as Dylan could remember, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. The old man had lived in his garage more than the house, tinkering with engines and metal parts, speaking in grunts and nods. Dylan had learned to be a mechanic not because his father taught him, but because it was the only language Ray seemed to understand. "Your father wanted you to have this," Mr. Winters, his father's attorney, said afterward, handing Dylan a set of keys. "The house goes to charity as he specified, but he was adamant that the truck go to you." Dylan looked down at the keys in his palm, worn, scratched from decades of use. "The truck? That piece of junk? He was very clear about it," Winters replied, already gathering his papers. "Said you'd know what to do with it." The '78 Ford pickup sat in the funeral home parking lot like a relic from another time. Its once red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, chipped in places to reveal the metal beneath. Dylan circled it slowly, running his fingers along the dents and scars of its body. Each one probably had a story behind it, but like everything else about Ray Harper, those stories had never been shared. When he turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life with surprising strength. Like the old man himself, rough around the edges but stubborn as hell. Driving back to his father's house, no, not his father's anymore, just the house now, Dylan tried to make sense of the gesture. In 28 years, Ray had given him exactly 3 things: his name, a roof until he was 18, and now this truck. Not once in those years had Ray told him he loved him. Not once had he explained why he kept the world at arm's length, why he drank himself to sleep most nights, or why he kept all those locks on his office door. "What am I supposed to do with this, old man?" Dylan muttered, slapping the steering wheel. The truck rumbled beneath him in response, the vibrations traveling up through the seat and into his bones. It smelled like his father, motor oil, cigarettes, and something else Dylan couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe? Back at the house, Dylan parked in the driveway and sat for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the windshield. He had 3 days to clear out his personal items before the estate company took over. 3 days to sift through the fragments of a life he'd never understood. He started with the truck. If the old man had left it to him specifically, maybe there was something to it beyond sentimentality, though sentimentality would have been out of character for Ray Harper anyway. The cab was surprisingly clean. No fast food wrappers, no scattered tools, nothing that gave away anything about the man who'd owned it. The glove compartment held only the owner's manual, the registration, and an ancient pack of cigarettes. Dylan checked under the seats, behind the sun visors, even pried up the floor mats. Nothing. It wasn't until he was lying on his back, checking the underside of the dashboard with a flashlight, that he saw it. A small metal box, no bigger than a cigarette pack, taped to the bottom of the dash. It had been painted the same color as the metal around it, nearly invisible unless you were looking for something hidden. Dylan's heart quickened as he pried it loose. The box was sealed with a single strip of electrical tape, yellowed with age. Inside was a folded piece of paper, so worn at the creases that it was nearly torn through. When he unfolded it, Dylan realized it was a map, hand-drawn in his father's precise, mechanical script. It showed highways, back roads, and 5 locations marked with red X's. Each X had a number beside it, 1 through 5, creating a path across 3 states. On the back, in the same careful handwriting, was a note. Follow this, son, and you'll understand everything. Dylan stared at the map, then flipped it over to read the note again. His father had never called him son in life. It had always been boy, or just Dylan. The intimacy of the word, even written, felt strange. He traced the route with his finger. The first X was marked at a place called Maggie's Diner, in a town called Millfield, about 2 hours north. The others were spread out, creating a path that ended at what appeared to be a remote location in the mountains. Dylan checked his watch. It was nearly 6 in the evening, and the rain was coming down harder now. The rational thing would be to get some sleep, start fresh in the morning. But something about the map, about his father's hidden message, wouldn't let him rest. He grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and started the truck again. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, clearing rivulets of rain just long enough for them to reform. As he pulled out of the driveway, Dylan caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw his father's face staring back at him, the same hard eyes, the same set of the jaw. He looked away quickly. The road stretched out before him, disappearing into the darkness beyond his headlights. Dylan had no idea what waited at the end of this strange treasure map, but for the first time in his life, his father had asked something of him directly. "All right, old man," he said to the empty truck cab. "Let's see what you were hiding." The truck's engine growled in response as Dylan pressed the accelerator, heading north into the storm, chasing the ghost of a man he'd never really known, guided only by a worn-out map and 6 words. "Follow this, son, and you'll understand everything." The storm had passed by the time Dylan reached Millfield, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and air that smelled of wet earth. Maggie's Diner sat at the edge of town, a silver bullet of a building that gleamed in the mid-morning sun. A neon sign buzzed above the entrance, the G in Maggie's flickering sporadically like a nervous tick. Dylan parked the truck and sat for a moment, studying the place. The lot was half full, mostly with sedans and a couple of dusty pickups that had seen better days. Nothing about the diner seemed remarkable, or worthy of being the first stop on his father's mysterious map. A bell jingled as he pushed through the door. The smell hit him immediately: coffee, bacon grease, and pancake syrup, the universal perfume of diners everywhere. The place was busy but not crowded, the morning rush thinning out as the clock edged toward lunch. Dylan slid into an empty booth by the window, the vinyl seat creaking beneath him. "Be right with you, honey," called a waitress from behind the counter, her back to him as she refilled coffee mugs. Dylan nodded, though she couldn't see him, and picked up a laminated menu. The prices were cheap, the offerings standard diner fare. Nothing special, nothing that screamed secret or revelation. "What can I get?" The waitress's voice cut off abruptly as she turned toward his booth, coffee pot suspended mid-air. She was in her 60s, maybe older, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and lines around her eyes that deepened as she stared at him. "Ray?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes and murmured conversations. Dylan's stomach tightened. "No, ma'am. I'm Dylan. Ray Harper was my father." The woman, Martha, according to her name tag, placed the coffee pot carefully on the table, as if afraid she might drop it. Her hand trembled slightly. "Was?" she asked. "He died last week. Heart attack." Martha sank into the seat across from him, uninvited. Her eyes, pale blue and suddenly glassy with unshed tears, never left his face. "Good Lord, you look just like him. Just like he did when—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I always knew he'd come back someday. Or send someone. And here you are, in his truck." Dylan leaned forward. "You knew my father? Knew him?" Martha laughed, a sound both sad and fond. "Oh, honey, your daddy spent half his life in that booth right there." She pointed to a corner booth, identical to all the others except for a small scratch in the table's surface. A crude initial R carved into the laminate. "Every Wednesday for years. Always ordered the same thing, black coffee and apple pie." Said it reminded him of home? Dylan tried to reconcile this information with the father he knew, a man who rarely left the house except for work, who never spoke of friends or a past beyond their small town. "When was this?" he asked. "Years ago now. Before you were born, I reckon." Martha's eyes narrowed, studying him. "You didn't know he used to live here?" Dylan shook his head. "My father never talked about his past. Never talked much at all, really." Something like understanding passed over Martha's face. She reached across the table and patted his hand, her skin papery against his. "That sounds like Ray. Always keeping his cards close." She glanced around the diner, then lowered her voice. "Listen, there's something you should know. Something Ray left with me a long time ago. Wait here." She shuffled away toward the back of the diner, disappearing through a door marked "Staff Only." Dylan watched her go, his mind racing. His father had lived here? Had frequented this unremarkable diner in this unremarkable town? Why had he never mentioned it? Martha returned a few minutes later, clutching a yellowed envelope. She slid into the booth again, holding the envelope with both hands as if it were something precious. "He came to see me about 15 years ago," she explained. "First time I'd seen him in ages. He looked haunted. Said if a young man ever came asking about him, I should give him this." She pushed the envelope across the table. "That's you, I reckon." Dylan stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in his father's unmistakable handwriting. The flap was sealed with the same electrical tape he'd found on the metal box beneath the dashboard. "Did he say anything else?" Dylan asked, not yet touching the envelope. Martha nodded. "He said if he comes, it means I'm gone, and it's finally safe." I didn't know what he meant then. Still don't, honestly. Dylan's throat felt suddenly dry. He reached for the envelope, the paper rough beneath his fingers. When he tore it open, a black and white photograph slid out onto the table. The picture showed a younger version of his father, thinner, with a full head of dark hair and without the permanent scowl Dylan had come to know. Beside him stood a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and a smile that reached her eyes. In her arms was a baby, swaddled in a blanket. Dylan flipped the photo over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, "Julia and Dylan, 1996. He looked up at Martha, his heart hammering. "This is my mother?" Martha's eyes widened in surprise. "You don't recognize her? I was told my mother left when I was a baby. That she couldn't handle being a parent." The words tasted bitter as he said them. "My father never kept photos of her around." Martha's face softened with a pity that made Dylan's skin crawl. "Oh, honey. That's not what happened at all." She reached out and tapped the photo. "That woman adored you. I remember when she used to bring you in here, just a tiny thing. She'd bounce you on her knee while Ray ate his pie." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What did he tell you about what happened to her?" Dylan swallowed hard. "Nothing. Just that she left. When I got older and asked questions, he'd shut down or get angry. Eventually, I stopped asking." Martha sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Ray Harper was a good man, but he carried some heavy burdens." She nodded toward the map, which Dylan had laid on the table. "Whatever he's leading you to, it's the truth. That much I know." She stood, straightening her apron. "The next place on that map, it's the old Harper house on the edge of town, isn't it?" Dylan checked the map. "Maybe. It's just marked as an address." "That'll be it. 1487 Sycamore Road." Martha's expression turned grave. "You be careful there. Some places hold on to their ghosts." As she walked away, Dylan stared at the photograph, at the woman who was apparently his mother, a stranger with his eyes and a smile he'd never seen. The baby in her arms looked content, loved. Nothing like the childhood he remembered. He folded the map, tucked the photograph carefully into his wallet, and left money on the table for a coffee he'd never ordered. The bell jingled again as he stepped back into the sunlight, his father's map in one hand, keys to the old truck in the other, and a growing sense that everything he believed about his life was built on lies. The old Harper house sat at the end of a winding gravel road, half hidden behind overgrown maple trees and tangles of wild blackberry bushes. It wasn't what Dylan had expected, not a rundown shack, but a once handsome two-story farmhouse with a wide front porch. The white paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood beneath to weather to the color of old bones. The windows stared out like vacant eyes, several cracked or broken entirely. Dylan parked the truck in what remained of the driveway, the tires crunching over weeds that had pushed through the gravel. As he stepped out, the silence struck him. No birds singing, no distant traffic, just the soft whisper of wind through the tall grass that had once been a lawn. A "No trespassing" sign hung crookedly on the front gate. The red letters faded to a dull rust color. Dylan ignored it, pushing through the creaking gate and approaching the house with caution. Each step up the porch stairs brought a protesting groan from the wood. The front door was locked but yielded easily to a firm push of his shoulder, the frame rotted enough to give way. The smell hit him first, dust and mildew, the musty breath of a house long abandoned. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, catching dust motes that danced in the stale air. Dylan stood in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. To his surprise, the house wasn't empty. Furniture remained draped in yellowed sheets like shrouded ghosts. Picture frames still hung on the walls, though many had fallen, their glass shattered on the floor. It was as if the occupants had left in a hurry, expecting to return but never making it back. Dylan moved through the rooms cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The kitchen held ancient appliances, a refrigerator with rounded corners, a stove with chrome details. On the counter sat a coffee mug, a film of dust inside it, as if someone had left it mid-sip decades ago. A door off the kitchen led to what must have been his father's study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed signs of more recent habitation. The dust wasn't as thick, and a kerosene lamp sat on the desk with matches beside it. Dylan struck one, lighting the lamp. The warm glow illuminated walls covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and maps, all connected by red string, creating a web of information that spanned the entire room. Dylan stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. Every clipping, every photo focused on the same subject, a missing woman named Julia Harper. His mother. Search continues for missing mother. Read one headline from 1997. Another. Local detective's wife still missing after 3 months. The articles detailed how Julia Harper had vanished without a trace, her car found abandoned at a local supermarket, no signs of struggle. And there, in the center of it all, was a photograph of his father, younger, dressed in a police uniform, his face grim as he spoke to reporters. The caption read, "Detective Raymond Harper leads search for his missing wife." Detective? His father had been a cop? Dylan's legs felt suddenly weak. He sank into the desk chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. All his life, he'd believed his mother had abandoned them, had chosen to leave. All his life, he'd carried the weight of that rejection, the certainty that he hadn't been enough to make her stay. And all along, she'd been missing. His father had lied to him, had let him believe a cruel fiction rather than the truth. But why? Dylan's attention turned to the desk itself. The drawers were locked, but he found a letter opener and a cup of pens and used it to force the central drawer open. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his father's neat handwriting. Beside it lay a tarnished police badge and a set of handcuffs, rusted with age. He opened the journal, finding entries dating back to 1997, the year his mother disappeared. "Third week with no leads," one entry read. "Department wants to scale back the search. Calloway says I'm too emotionally involved. As if I could be anything else when it's Julia who's missing." Another dated months later. "They've officially classified it as a cold case. Told me to take leave, to focus on Dylan. How can I look at my son knowing I've failed to find his mother? Calloway has blocked every attempt to follow the trafficking angle. Something isn't right. He knows more than he's saying." Dylan flipped through page after page, each entry more desperate than the last. His father had documented years of private investigation, following leads the police department had abandoned, tracking down witnesses, building a case that pointed toward an organized trafficking ring operating in the area. And everywhere, the name Calloway appeared, always as an obstacle, always shutting down leads, redirecting resources, blocking search warrants. Found another connection between Calloway and Mercer today. Read an entry from 2003. Phone records show they spoke 6 times the day Julia disappeared. When I brought it up, the chief suspended me. They're all protecting him. I'm turning in my badge tomorrow. I'll find her on my own. The final entries were scattered, years apart, growing increasingly paranoid. Ray had become convinced that he was being watched, that powerful people were keeping him from the truth. The last entry, dated just a year ago, was chilling in its clarity. They're still watching the house. After all these years. I think Dylan might be in danger if I pursue this any further. I've hidden everything at the 5 points. If anything happens to me, the map will lead him to the truth. And to her, if she's still alive. I have to believe she is. As Dylan closed the journal, his foot knocked against something beneath the desk. Kneeling down, he found a loose floorboard. When he pried it up, he discovered a hidden compartment containing a rusted metal lockbox. The box wasn't locked. Inside, Dylan found a manila envelope containing several photographs of a man in an expensive suit talking to another man outside what appeared to be a warehouse. The photos were grainy, taken from a distance, but the faces were clear enough. On the back of one, his father had written, Calloway and Mercer, May 2015. Same warehouse as 1997. Also in the box was a cassette tape labeled simply, Julia, and a small handgun, loaded and wrapped in an oily cloth. Dylan sat back on his heels, the pieces falling into place. His father hadn't been a distant, broken man by nature. He'd been a detective, obsessively hunting for the truth about his wife's disappearance. And he believed she hadn't just disappeared, she'd been taken. By people with enough power to cover it up, to turn a missing persons case into a cold file, to force a detective off the force. People who might still be out there. People who might be watching. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Dylan froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He wasn't alone. Quickly he gathered the journal, the photos, and the cassette tape, stuffing them into his jacket pockets. He left the gun. He had no permit, and the last thing he needed was to be caught with an unregistered weapon. The map showed his next destination clearly now, Crescent State Penitentiary, about 100 miles east. Moving as quietly as possible, Dylan extinguished the lamp and crept back through the house toward the front door. But as he reached the entryway, headlights swept across the front windows, a car pulling up behind his truck. He ducked into the shadows, heart pounding. Through a crack in the curtains, he could see 2 men in plain clothes emerging from an unmarked sedan. One held what looked like a police radio. They were coming for the house, for the evidence his father had gathered. Or for him. Dylan slipped out the back door and into the overgrown yard, keeping low. The old truck was his only way out, but to reach it meant passing the men now approaching the front porch. As they disappeared inside the house, Dylan made his move, creeping along the side of the property and circling back to the driveway. He slid into the truck, praying the engine wouldn't give him away. The key turned, the engine caught, and Dylan hit the gas before the men could react. In the rearview mirror, he saw them burst from the house, one reaching inside his jacket. Dylan didn't wait to see if they were drawing weapons. He floored the accelerator, the old truck fishtailing on the gravel before finding traction. The chase was on. And so was the hunt for the truth about Julia Harper. Dawn broke in pale streaks across the horizon as Dylan pulled into a gas station 50 miles from Crescent State Penitentiary. He'd driven through the night, taking back roads and switching directions multiple times to ensure he wasn't being followed. The truck's gas gauge hovered just above empty, and exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. Inside the station's minimart, he bought coffee, a sandwich, and a cheap prepaid phone. The cassette tape from his father's lockbox burned a hole in his pocket, but without a player, it was useless. The journal, however, had kept him company through the long night. By flashlight, at rest stops, he pieced together more of his father's obsessive investigation. One name kept appearing in the later entries, Harold Grayson. According to Ray's notes, Grayson had been arrested for a series of robberies in 1998, But during the investigation, he tried to bargain with information about Julia's disappearance. No one had taken him seriously except Ray. Sitting in the truck, Dylan called the penitentiary. "I'd like to arrange a visit with an inmate," he said when the administrative office answered. "Harold Grayson. Relationship to the prisoner?" The woman's voice was bored, mechanical. Dylan hesitated. "He's an old family friend. My father recently passed away, and there are some matters I need to discuss with him." 2 hours later, Dylan sat in a sterile visiting room, the smell of industrial cleaner burning his nostrils. The walls were institutional beige, the tables bolted to the floor. Guards stood at every exit, their expressions impassive. The door buzzed, and Harold Grayson shuffled in, hands and feet shackled. He was older than Dylan had expected, at least 70, with a stooped posture and paper-thin skin stretched over prominent bones. His jumpsuit hung from his frame as if he'd been deflated. Grayson's eyes, however, were sharp, dark and calculating beneath bushy white eyebrows. They widened slightly as they landed on Dylan. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice a sandpaper rasp. "Ray Harper's boy. You've got his look." Dylan leaned forward. "You know who I am?" "Course I do. Your daddy showed me your picture once. Proud of you, he was, in his own closed-off way." Grayson lowered himself into the chair across from Dylan with a grunt. "So, he finally kicked it, huh? Heart give out. How did you know?" Grayson tapped his temple. "Ray always said it'd be his heart or a bullet that got him. Too stubborn for anything else." He cocked his head. "You found the map, then? How do you know about the map?" "Because I'm the one who told him to make it." Grayson's chains clinked as he rested his hands on the table. "Your daddy came to see me every few months for years. Told me everything he found out about your mama's case. I was his sounding board, hell, maybe his only friend toward the end." Dylan pulled out the journal, keeping it below the table's edge, out of sight of the guards. "Why would he confide in you? According to this, you were just some thief he arrested." Grayson's laugh was a dry, rattling sound. "Is that what he wrote? Well, I suppose that's simpler than the truth. I wasn't just some thief, boy. I was Calloway's driver for 15 years. I knew where all the bodies were buried, sometimes literally." Dylan's pulse quickened. "Richard Calloway? The politician?" "Politician." Grayson spat the word. "That man is a glorified crime boss with a nice suit and friends in high places. Back then, he was just an up-and-coming assistant district attorney with ambition and no moral compass. What did he have to do with my mother?" Grayson glanced at the guards, then leaned closer. "Your daddy was a good cop. Too good. He started connecting dots nobody wanted connected. Girls going missing from truck stops, motels, poor neighborhoods. Nobody important cared until your mama disappeared." "She was taken?" Dylan's voice cracked on the last word. "Not exactly." Grayson's eyes burned with something like guilt. "She found out what Ray was investigating. Started putting pieces together herself. She was smart, your mama. Too smart." A guard stepped closer, and Grayson straightened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "One night, she called Ray in a panic. Said she'd found something in Calloway's office, papers, photographs. Evidence. Ray told her to stay put, that he was coming. By the time he got there, she was gone. Car found 2 days later at the supermarket, staged to look like a random abduction. But it wasn't random. Nothing in this world happens by chance, boy. Especially not when Richard Calloway's involved." Grayson shifted in his seat, the chains between his ankles rattling. "Your daddy knew right away who was behind it. But Calloway had friends everywhere. The department, the DA's office, even the feds. Every door Ray tried to open got slammed in his face. So what happened to her? Is she?" Dylan couldn't bring himself to finish the question. "Dead?" Grayson shook his head. "Not as far as I know. Last I heard, she was alive but hidden. Witness protection maybe, or something less official. Ray never stopped looking, but the closer he got, the more dangerous things became. That's why he made the map, A breadcrumb trail that only you could follow when the time was right. But why me? Why not go to the authorities with what he knew? Grayson's laugh was bitter. What part of Calloway had friends everywhere didn't you understand? The authorities were the problem. As for why you? His expression softened. Because you're her son. Because he failed her, but he wasn't going to fail you too. Because some truths can only be trusted to blood. A guard approached, tapping his watch. Time's up, Grayson. Grayson nodded, then fixed Dylan with an intense stare. Listen carefully now. Whatever you do, don't go to the cops. Don't trust anyone connected to Millfield. Calloway's still got eyes and ears everywhere. But how do I find her? The next location on the map is just an address. That's Calloway's hunting cabin. Remote, isolated. Perfect place to keep secrets. Grayson stood as the guard moved to escort him out. Be careful there. Man like that doesn't leave his property unprotected. As Grayson turned to leave, Dylan called after him. Wait, how did you end up here? Was it really just for robbery? Grayson's smile was grim. I got sloppy. Started feeling guilty about the things I'd seen, the things I'd helped cover up. Tried to take some insurance, documents, recordings. Calloway caught me. Set me up for a robbery I didn't commit, made sure I got the maximum sentence. His eyes hardened. Your daddy was the arresting officer. He knew it was a setup, but he also knew it was the only way to keep me alive. In here, Calloway couldn't get to me easily. The guard tugged at Grayson's arm. Let's go. As they led him away, Grayson called over his shoulder. Check the visitor's log on your way out. See who else has been coming to see old Harold lately. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, leaving Dylan alone with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. As he signed out, Dylan casually asked to see the visitor's log for the past month. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated only briefly before turning the book toward him. There, 3 days before Ray Harper's death, was his father's signature. And 2 days after his death, another name leaped from the page, Richard Calloway. Is this common? Dylan asked, pointing to Calloway's name. For a state senator to visit inmates? The clerk shrugged. Senator Calloway sits on the Prison Reform Committee. He visits different facilities now and then. Makes him look good in election years. But Dylan knew better. Calloway hadn't come for a photo op. He'd come to see what Grayson might have told Ray Harper during their final visit. As Dylan walked back to the truck, a guard called after him, jogging to catch up. Hey, you dropped this, the man said, pressing a folded piece of paper into Dylan's hand. But Dylan hadn't dropped anything. He waited until he was back in the truck to unfold the note. Cabin is watched. Go to this address first. Ask for Marie. Below was an address in Lakewood, the same town where Calloway's cabin was located. The guard had slipped him information deliberately. But could he trust it? Could he trust anyone? With no better options, Dylan started the truck and headed east. The next piece of the puzzle, and possibly his mother, awaited him at Calloway's cabin. But first, it seemed, he had another detour to make. One more breadcrumb on his father's trail of secrets. The guard tugged at Grayson's arm. Let's go. As they led him away, Grayson called over his shoulder. Check the visitor's log on your way out. See who else has been coming to see old Harold lately. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, leaving Dylan alone with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. As he signed out, Dylan casually asked to see the visitor's log for the past month. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated only briefly before turning the book toward him. There, 3 days before Ray Harper's death, was his father's signature. And 2 days after his death, another name leaped from the page, Richard Calloway. Is this common? Dylan asked, pointing to Calloway's name. For a state senator to visit inmates? The clerk shrugged. Senator Calloway sits on the Prison Reform Committee. He visits different facilities now and then. Makes him look good in election years. But Dylan knew better. Calloway hadn't come for a photo op. He'd come to see what Grayson might have told Ray Harper during their final visit. As Dylan walked back to the truck, a guard called after him, jogging to catch up. "Hey, you dropped this," the man said, pressing a folded piece of paper into Dylan's hand. But Dylan hadn't dropped anything. He waited until he was back in the truck to unfold the note. "Cabin is watched. Go to this address first. Ask for Marie." Below was an address in Lakewood, the same town where Calloway's cabin was located. The guard had slipped him information deliberately. But could he trust it? Could he trust anyone? With no better options, Dylan started the truck and headed east. The next piece of the puzzle, and possibly his mother, awaited him at Calloway's cabin. But first, it seemed, he had another detour to make. One more breadcrumb on his father's trail of secrets. Lakewood was a study in contrasts, weathered trailers and modest homes on its outskirts giving way to sprawling lakeside estates with manicured lawns and private docks. Dylan drove slowly through the wealthy section, the truck's rumbling engine drawing curious glances from people walking purebred dogs or jogging in expensive athletic wear. The address from the guard's note led to a small house tucked between two much larger properties. Unlike its ostentatious neighbors, this home was modest, a single-story cottage with peeling blue paint and flower boxes overflowing with petunias. It looked out of place, like it had been transported from another neighborhood entirely. Dylan parked across the street, studying the house for several minutes. No movement behind the curtained windows, no car in the short driveway. But someone had recently watered those flowers. They were too vibrant to be neglected. Gathering his courage, he approached the front door and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. Just as he was about to give up, the door opened a crack, secured by a chain. A woman's eye appeared in the gap, brown, suspicious, lined at the corner. "What do you want?" Her voice was sharp, defensive. "I'm looking for Marie. A guard at Crescent State sent me." The eye narrowed. "Which guard?" Dylan realized he didn't know the man's name. "Tall guy, brown hair, scar on his chin." "Marcus," she said, almost to herself. The door closed briefly, then reopened fully. "Get in here before someone sees you." The woman was in her 50s, her hair salt and pepper and cropped short. She wore a housekeeper's uniform, pale blue with a white collar, and her hands were rough, the nails cut short. "You're Ray's boy," she said, not a question but a statement. "How does everyone know who I am?" Dylan's frustration bubbled over. "I've spent my life not knowing anything about my father or mother, and suddenly everyone I meet knows more about my family than I do." Marie's expression softened. "Sit down. I need to be quick. I'm due at the Calloway house in 30 minutes. Dylan froze. "You work for Richard Calloway?" 23 years. "I clean his house, do his laundry, and occasionally overhear things I shouldn't." She moved to a bookshelf and slid out a false back, revealing a hidden compartment containing a small fireproof safe. "Your father paid me to be his eyes and ears. Not much, but enough to supplement my income and put my daughter through community college." "My father hired you to spy on Calloway?" Marie entered a combination and opened the safe. "Ray saved my life once, back when he was still on the force. Domestic violence call. My ex-husband had a gun to my head when Ray talked him down." She pulled out a flash drive and a key. "I owed him. And I hated working for a man like Calloway, knowing what he was capable of." She handed both items to Dylan. "The flash drive has copies of documents I've photographed over the years. The key is to Calloway's filing cabinet in his hunting cabin, the one your father could never get into. But won't Calloway notice if things are missing from his cabin?" Marie shook her head. "He hasn't been to the cabin in months. Too busy with his Senate campaign. But he's heading there this weekend. Marcus overheard him making arrangements while visiting the prison." Dylan's hand closed around the key. "What's on the flash drive?" "Evidence. Financial records showing payments to police officers, including your father's former chief. Emails about merchandise being moved across state lines. And photographs." She hesitated. "Of your mother." Dylan's heart stuttered. "Recent photographs?" Marie nodded. "Taken 3 years ago." "She's alive, Dylan. Or at least she was then." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His mother was alive. All these years, while he believed she'd abandoned him, she'd been out there somewhere. Why didn't my father tell me? Why let me believe she left us? To protect you. Marie glanced at her watch, anxiety creasing her face. Ray was convinced that if you knew the truth, you'd go looking for her, and that would put both of you in danger. Calloway has a long memory and no mercy for people who cross him. Where is she now? The last address Ray had is on that flash drive. A small town in Oregon. But that was 3 years ago. She might have moved again. Marie picked up her purse. I have to go. The cabin will be empty until Friday night. Whatever you're going to do, do it before then. Why are you helping me? Dylan asked as she ushered him toward the door. Marie's expression darkened. Because I've worked for that monster for 23 years. I've seen the girls he brings to his parties, young, scared. I've cleaned up after his business meetings. I've washed blood out of his clothes. And I've kept my mouth shut because I was a single mother who needed the job. Her voice hardened. But I'm done being silent. My daughter's grown now, with a life of her own. I've got nothing left to lose. She opened the door a crack, checking the street before letting him out. Be careful. And whatever you find, make it count. Calloway's hunting cabin was a monument to masculine excess. All dark wood, mounted trophy heads, and leather furniture. Set deep in the woods at the end of a private road, it was the perfect place for a powerful man to conduct business away from prying eyes. Dylan picked the simple lock on the back door with a technique he'd learned from YouTube, grateful for the cabin's isolation. Inside, the air was stale, with underlying notes of cigar smoke and whiskey. The filing cabinet stood in Calloway's office, an imposing metal fortress beside a mahogany desk. Dylan's palms sweated as he inserted Marie's key, half expecting an alarm to sound. Instead, the lock turned with a soft click. The files inside were meticulously organized, labeled folders arranged by date and subject. Dylan pulled out one labeled Harper, with shaking hands. Inside was a complete police report on Julia Harper's disappearance, not the redacted version that had been released to the public, but the original, with witness statements, forensic reports, and detailed timelines. Attached was a memo from the police chief ordering the case closed due to insufficient evidence and departmental resource constraints. But most damning was a handwritten note from Calloway himself. Make this go away. Harper knows too much. I've taken care of the wife. She won't be talking to anyone. Dylan's vision blurred with rage as he continued through the files. There were photographs of his mother, surveillance pictures taken over the years. In the earliest, she looked terrified, gaunt. In later ones, she appeared stronger but wary, always looking over her shoulder. The most recent, dated just a year ago, showed her outside a small cabin in the woods, her hair now gray but her face unmistakably the same as the woman in the photo from Maggie's diner. Another folder contained transcripts of calls between Calloway and someone named Mercer, discussing the Harper situation and the need to keep her contained. There were financial records showing monthly payments to an offshore account. Hush money, Dylan realized. His mother hadn't left voluntarily. She'd been forced into hiding, threatened into silence, her life bought with monthly payments and the promise that her son would remain safe as long as she stayed away. As he photographed document after document with his phone, Dylan came across one final folder, labeled simply, Ray. Inside was a police report dated the previous week, detailing his father's death. The official cause was listed as heart attack, but a toxicology report flagged uncertain levels of a rarely detected poison. His father hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered, silenced just as he was getting too close to the truth again. With trembling hands, Dylan gathered everything he could carry, the originals of the most damning documents, the photographs of his mother, the toxicology report. He was almost to the door when headlights swept across the cabin windows. Someone was coming up the drive. Dylan froze, clutching the documents to his chest, staring at the approaching lights like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. The final location on his father's map, the one he hadn't reached yet, suddenly became clear. It wasn't just a destination. It was a refuge. Dylan ducked behind heavy curtains as the vehicle pulled up outside. Through a gap in the fabric, he watched a black SUV park beside the cabin. Two men emerged, not Calloway, but security types with telltale bulges beneath their jackets. A routine check, perhaps, or someone had noticed the truck parked down the road. There was no time to think. Dylan shoved the documents inside his jacket and slipped through the back door seconds before the men entered through the front. The woods behind the cabin offered his only escape route. He ran, branches whipping his face in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, shouts erupted from the cabin. They'd discovered the broken lock, the opened filing cabinet. Flashlight beams cut through the trees, searching. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Dylan reached his father's truck, hidden on an old logging trail. He started the engine and drove with headlights off until he reached the main road, then headed north, toward the final X on his father's map. The coordinates led deep into the mountains, to a place so remote that the paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for the truck. By dawn, Dylan was navigating by the map alone, following landmarks his father had noted: a lightning-struck pine, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, a creek crossing with stepping stones arranged in an unnatural pattern. The final marker was a tree with a crude carving, RH+JH, inside a heart. Beyond it, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, stood a cabin. Unlike Calloway's ostentatious hunting lodge, this was a true woodland cabin, modest, practical, built to blend with its surroundings rather than dominate them. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a small garden grew along its southern wall. Dylan approached slowly, exhaustion making his movements clumsy. He hadn't slept properly in days, had barely eaten. The documents from Calloway's office felt heavy in his jacket, weighted with decades of secrets and lies. Before he could knock, the cabin door opened. She stood framed in the doorway, a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her face was lined, weathered by years and worry, but her eyes, Dylan recognized those eyes from his own reflection. "Julia Harper," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Her hand went to her mouth, tears immediately welling in those familiar eyes. "Dylan?" The name came out broken, disbelieving. For a moment, they just stared at each other, mother and son, separated by 25 years of absence, of lies, of lost time. Then she was moving toward him, and he toward her, and they collided in an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both off balance. She felt small in his arms, fragile yet strong, smelling of wood smoke and herbs and something undefinable that triggered the most primitive part of his brain. This is what a mother smells like. This is home. "I never thought I'd see you," she whispered against his chest. "He promised he'd bring you when it was safe, but then I heard about Ray, and I thought..." Her voice broke. "He left me a map," Dylan said, pulling back enough to look at her face. 5 locations. "It led me to you." She nodded, wiping tears. "The contingency plan. He said if anything happened to him, you'd find your way here." A sad smile touched her lips. "He was always so certain you had his detective instincts." Inside the cabin was warm, lit by oil lamps and a crackling fire. It was sparsely furnished but comfortable. Bookshelves lined the walls, plants grew in every available corner, and photographs stood on the mantel. Dylan was shocked to see himself among them: school pictures, sports team photos, even a candid shot of his high school graduation. "He kept me updated," Julia explained, following his gaze. "At great risk to himself. Every few months he'd make the journey here, bringing news and photos." "But why?" Dylan's voice cracked with emotion. "Why let me believe you abandoned us? Why not tell me the truth?" Julia's face crumpled. "It was the only way to keep you safe." She took his hands in hers, her fingers thin but strong. "I discovered what Calloway was doing, using his position to facilitate trafficking. Young women, vulnerable women, disappearing and being transported across state lines. When I found evidence connecting him directly, I was going to bring it to the FBI. But they got to you first." She nodded. "Calloway's men caught me at his office. I thought they would finish me, but Calloway was too smart for that. A dead prosecutor's wife would raise too many questions. Instead, he gave me a choice: disappear completely, tell no one what I knew, or watch my family die. So you ran? Not at first. I fought until they showed me photos of you at school, at home, playing in the yard. Photos that proved they could get to you anytime. Her voice hardened. That's when I agreed to vanish. Ray helped me escape, set up this place. But we agreed he couldn't come with me. It would be too obvious, raise too many questions. And you were too young to understand the need for secrecy. So you both decided to let me believe a lie. To grow up thinking my mother didn't want me. It's the decision I've regretted every day of my life, she said quietly. But I would make it again to keep you alive. Dylan pulled the documents from inside his jacket. I found these at Calloway's cabin. Evidence of everything: the trafficking, the cover-up, your disappearance. Even Dad's. Julia's eyes widened. The heart attack was induced. I have the toxicology report. She took the papers with trembling hands. After all this time, Ray finally found the proof. Her expression hardened. With this, we could destroy Calloway. That's exactly what I plan to do, Dylan said. But we need to be smart. Calloway still has connections, still has power. Julia's face brightened with fierce determination. I have connections too, people who've helped me stay hidden all these years. A network of survivors and advocates. With this evidence, we can finally come out of the shadows. For the first time in days, Dylan felt something like hope. They stayed up through the night, organizing the evidence, creating copies, planning their next steps. By morning, they had a strategy. Julia would reach out to a trusted journalist and a federal prosecutor she'd once helped escape Calloway's organization. Dylan would secure the original documents in a safe deposit box, insurance against any attempt to silence them. As dawn broke, Dylan stepped onto the cabin's porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. 28 years of believing one truth about his life, only to discover another. His father hadn't been distant and broken, he'd been protective and relentless. His mother hadn't abandoned him, she'd sacrificed everything to keep him safe. He heard the cabin door open behind him, felt his mother's presence as she joined him on the porch. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I wish Dad could be here to see this. To know we found each other." Julia slipped her hand into his. "He knew we would. That's why he created the map. He believed in you." Dylan looked down at the keys to his father's truck, worn smooth from decades of use. The vehicle that had carried him across states, through danger, to this moment of truth and reconciliation. "You know," he said, "I think I finally understand why he left me that old truck. It wasn't just transportation. It was connection, to his father, to his past, to the truth. The final piece of Ray Harper's legacy, guiding his son home." As they stood together, watching the new day dawn, Dylan felt a strange peace settle over him. The road ahead would be dangerous, confronting Calloway, seeking justice, rebuilding a relationship with the mother he'd never known. But for the first time, he wasn't traveling alone. His father's final road map had led him exactly where he needed to be,